Years ago, right behind where I'm standing, just a stone's throw from my... Excuse me. Years ago, right behind where I'm standing, just a stone's throw from my apartment, existed a mental hospital. Now a Toyota R&D plant, the Ypsilanti State Hospital used to do all the great 20th century hospital stuff. It experimented with LSD, it did lobotomies, it electrocuted some people. It was even the training ground for Jonas Salk, inventor of the polio vaccine. And of course, it had its share of unethical psychological research.
Well, I wrote this song for the Christian youth. I want to teach kids the Christian truth. If you want to reach those kids on the street, then you gotta do a rap to a hip-hop beat.
Hello again from the Socialist Republic of Washtenaw County. I'm Danny the Highlighter Thief. In 1959, an infamous study took place in the Ypsilanti State Hospital. A renowned social psychologist named Milton Rokeach set up a trial to attempt to cure one or more people of their schizophrenic belief that they were the second coming of Jesus. Interestingly, my dad went to a lecture given by Rokeach's wife in college, so who better to tell this story than me, a dude who lives close by, has stayed in a mental hospital, looks like this, and is a mere 3 degrees of Kevin Bacon from our researcher.
The experiment was performed as follows. 3 men diagnosed with schizophrenia who all believed that they were Jesus Christ were given a shared living space and regular group therapy sessions together. Rokeach hoped that when the men were confronted with clashing delusions, their psychoses would break and they would be healed.
Now I say that Rokeach hoped for this, but really it was a secondary goal. The goal was to examine the effects of confronting peripheral beliefs versus confronting primitive beliefs. That is to say, Rokeach believed that one's opinions and ideology can change without affecting one's personal core truths, but one's personal core truths cannot change without a drastic rearrangement of their opinions, ideology, and trusted authority figures. But it would be an obvious ethical violation to try to destroy people's primitive beliefs about themselves, especially because most primitive beliefs are also held by others. I mean, that's what happened to Ted Kaczynski at Harvard, and look how that turned out. After giving his 2 young daughters a panic attack by calling them by each other's names, Rokeach observed that it was extremely distressing for anyone's identity or fundamental worldview to be challenged. You can observe this in undercover agents who have identity crises while working under assumed names, in celebrities who change their names, and in transgender people being dead named or misgendered. This is used to advantage by places like prisons who dehumanize prisoners by reducing people's identity to mere strings of numbers, 24601 style.
Now, prisoner 24601. Your time is up and your parole's begun.
And of course, as is the legal requirement whenever discussing anything related to psychology, Rokeach gives lip service to Solomon Asch, whose conformity experiment forced people to reevaluate something which they could objectively see to be true and which they would assume others could too. After considering just how distressing all these examples were, even for a short testing period, Rokeach realized he needed people whose primitive beliefs he could change without an obvious ethical risk, thus schizophrenia. People with schizophrenia hold primitive beliefs that are objectively false. To change a schizophrenic person's belief would be to cure them. Rokeach could easily argue that this cause was noble, but how would he change them? He knew he couldn't just call them by different names like his kids. They were adults, and that's simply the nature of delusions. They resist outside influence. He needed to attack a different pillar of primitive belief. Not the belief in one's identity, but the belief that only one person can have any specific identity. And to accomplish this, he decided to bring 3 people with the same identity into a controlled environment. As for the reason he chose Jesus, it's probably because it's a common psychosis, but maybe it just made for a really badass book title. At first, the Christs fight, argue, things even briefly get physical, which I think I should mention Jesus only ever did in the ring. Almost nothing budges except that they eventually become friendly enough and stop quarreling, allowing each other to hold their delusions out of some mutual empathy. Leon shows temporary improvement, but ultimately the men are still convinced that they are Jesus and their fellow subjects are just crazy or perhaps dead and controlled by machines. Quoting from Slate, only Leon seems to waver, eventually asking to be addressed as Dr. Righteous Ideal Dung instead of his previous moniker of Dr. Domino Dominorum et Rex Rexarum Simplis Christanis Puer Mentalis Doctor reincarnation of Jesus Christ of Nazareth. Although sympathetic towards people with schizophrenia for its time, Rokeach's methods are questionable and sometimes cruel, and he often indulges the men's delusions. Rokeach's grad students, who seem to have tremendous empathy for their patients, begin to resent their lead researcher. He isn't on the grounds enough, he comes in and purposely antagonizes the Christ, cementing further their own perceived parallels to Christ's persecution. He brings in a news clipping that mocks the Christ and shows it to them, leading Leon to feel hurt and betrayed. After the grad students leave, in an effort to provide positive authority figures for the Christs, Rokeach begins sending fake letters to Leon, pretending to be Leon's imaginary wife, Madam Yeti Woman, in order to manipulate his psyche. And no, it's not that kind of Yeti. It's not weird, it's just referring to a Himalayan tribe exempt from original sin that Leon seems to have made up. And they eat rats. Joseph receives fake letters from the hospital administration, specifically from a doctor he believes to be his father, suggesting changes in his routine and putting him on placebo pills before abruptly cutting them off. In both cases, contact is cut when the letters begin to challenge the men's delusions, with Leon again feeling betrayed and sadly expressing that the truth was now his only friend. Let me know in the comments if you want me to do a full video on Leon, because he's quite an interesting figure, but this video is already getting too long. One thing I will mention, though, is the degree to which Leon incorporates the people around him into his narrative, and the degree to which Rokeach sculpts these incorporations. After Leon cuts ties with Madam Yeti Woman, a new assistant named Miss Anderson enters the study, and Leon immediately dubs her God Morphe Anderson. He says that he believes she is God after seemingly saying the exact same thing to the head nurse a mere 3 days earlier. Several other people from the hospital staff are endowed by Leon with holy attributes. He claims that many of them are, I guess, bisexual morphodites. Morphodite here meaning a person who alternates sexes rather than an intersex person. Rokeach allows, perhaps encourages this to happen, and feeds Leon's belief outside of group sessions while bluntly confronting him within them. This is one of many points in the study that feels more like one of those old just for laughs gags than a sincere attempt at helping these men. It doesn't make sense to me to attempt to break a man's delusions by tactless confrontation after repeatedly giving him solid evidence that he is correct. It sounds more like a good way to convince him that you're conspiring against him, which is exactly what happened. Although by the end there does seem to be some shaky form of respect between Leon and Rokeach. If you want to know more about the specifics of the experiment, you can watch Georgia Marie's video, which does a good job describing interactions throughout the study and getting into the backstories of all involved. The study lasted 2 years and ended up having almost no scientific value. In fact, it was an unmitigated failure. There is definitely something to say about the coping mechanisms employed by the three, each of whom were at a different developmental stage in their delusion, with Clyde, the most advanced in his psychosis, favoring denial, and Leon, the youngest, favoring a more intellectualized defense. It was important to Leon that he stay consistent and not outright deny the most obvious realities, and he was therefore the most distressed by the experiment, as Joseph and Clyde were beyond the point where they could conceivably have existential crises. But keep in mind, this study had an N of 3, so there isn't much we can actually conclude on a larger scale. This book is interesting because the Christs were interesting people, but this comes at the expense of practical application or any chance at replication. Rokeach had failed outright. He didn't significantly shift any primitive beliefs the Christs had. The most salient thing Rokeach learned from this experiment was that his own belief that he could change these men was nothing more than another God delusion. But why is this God delusion so prevalent? Rokeach got his idea from a man named Simon Morin, who was burnt at the stake in the 17th century for claiming to be Jesus. He'd met another person who also believed he was God, and this caused him to waver on his delusion. There was also a story about 2 women who both believed they were the Virgin Mary, leading to one of their delusions breaking, although not for the better. She just started saying that she's Anne, the mother of Mary. Religious paranoias are an extremely common manifestation of psychosis, and every time someone flips out on Flocka, PCP, or K2, they start screaming about being Jesus.
You know what? I come to realize I'm Jesus Christ and I can do anything I fucking want to.
In fact, Jesus was and is thought by some people to have exhibited symptoms of a mental illness presenting with psychosis. Here's a fun quote from Charles Benet Sangre.
In short, the nature of the hallucinations. No, that's not good. In short, the nature of the hallucinations of Jesus, as they are described in the Orthodox Gospels, permits us to conclude that the founder of the Christian religion was afflicted with religious paranoia. Indeed, in the eyes of some, Jesus was little more than an overly eccentric neurodivergent rabbi, or a David Koresh figure who had a little bit more success before being executed by the government, minus the, well, you know. I mean, a large portion of the New Testament is seemingly dedicated to retrofitting Jesus with the prophesied requirements he was missing for being the Son of Man. It's a real possibility that Jesus was just a dude with religious delusions, just like Leon, Clyde, and Joseph, just like L. Ron Hubbard, Joseph Smith, and Sun Myung Moon. And Jesus wasn't even exceptional in his own era. It kind of happened all the time back then, people being put to death for believing that they're a messiah. The Roman government didn't want the Jews to have a strong religious leader, as it would compromise their ability to control them. According to the writings of Flavius Josephus, Simon of Perea was beheaded for his messianic practice, and a revolutionary messiah named Anthronges is thought to have been crucified along with 2,000 members of his flock, both right before Jesus' death. These executions were political. Kill the leader, kill the insurrection. Jesus was just another in a proud line that stretches centuries backwards and forwards. And Jesus' crucifixion as a Jewish enemy of the state was very similar to that of subsequent dissident messiah figures such as Theudas, Simon bar Giora, Menachem ben Judah ben Hezekiah, and Simon bar Kochba. For those keeping track, we're now up to 4 Simons who all believed they were messiahs and were all put to death. Anyway, back to the modern day. According to a paper by Alan Geddes, basically every mental hospital has a few Jesuses living there. And there's some debate on why this phenomenon is so prevalent. It's the perfect intersection of a persecution complex and delusions of grandeur, both common symptoms of schizophrenia. And each potentially leads to the other. A paranoid person may develop grandeur by the logic that if so many people are out to get them, they must be important. A grandiose person may encounter people who challenge their beliefs and interpret this as persecution. In his conclusion, Rokeach brings up Freud's take on delusional grandiosity. Now, can you guess what Freud said it was? That's right! A defense against homosexuality! Gold star! But Rokeach favors the explanation of subsequent psychologists who believe that it was about sexual confusion, but was not specifically about being homosex. I don't really agree with either, but we'll indulge Rokeach for a second. Rokeach details the sexual confusions of the men. Clyde being overprotective, infantile, and passive, unable to fulfill society's expectations of men. Joseph being called Josephine by his sadistic father and never being able to form a masculine identity, as well as being forced to speak French at home, a language scientifically proven to be gay. And Leon most of all, whose sexual confusion permeated nearly all facets of his stay at the hospital. He was raised fatherless by a fanatically religious, delusional mother who couldn't provide a positive feminine or masculine role model to Leon, leading him to be seemingly proto-gender fluid. He talked about sex all the time and eventually claimed to be married to himself, being both husband and wife. Rokeach argues that these sexual confusions are perhaps where each of their delusions of grandeur began. Clyde and Joseph looking to quell their feelings of male incompetence, and Leon looking for absolution from the guilt caused by his apparently sinful sexual desires and his confusion about his gender identity. But I just don't feel that the evidence backs this up. For context, Clyde's hallucinations began when he was arrested and abruptly cut off after a decade of heavy alcohol consumption. It's possible he didn't even have schizophrenia, as that usually manifests much earlier in life. Instead, it could be that Clyde's mental break happened because of alcohol withdrawal delirium and lasted because of advanced chronic alcohol hallucinosis. Strangely, he was not a religious man before, so Clyde is the most mysterious case. From an early age, Joseph showed signs of obsessive compulsion and symptoms most consistent with schizotypal personality disorder. Joseph apparently started drastically descending after a car crash in which he badly injured all other parties. He became severely paranoid and was admitted to a psychiatric ward where he would develop his religious delusions 10 years later. His daughter speculated that it was due to his desire to be important, and he'd also had a lifelong superiority complex. Leon almost certainly got his schizophrenia from his genetics and his religious paranoia from his extremist mother. Perhaps it was in an effort to be loved more dearly by her, as she clearly loved Jesus more than she did Leon, or to gain a semblance of control in a life which was so thoroughly manipulated by his mother. So I'm not so sure about the Freudian angle, but consistent to some degree with Rokeach's speculations, the Christ delusion can also be a shield against extreme inferiority complexes stemming from fragile masculinity or otherwise. I mean, who the hell is gonna think Jesus is inferior? Besides, I guess, Jaden Animations.
How long have they been saying soon?
Thousands of years, maybe?
Striving for complete superiority takes the brain to the most logical step. God. Who's more superior than God? Their inferiority complex is then made into a Luciferian opponent. It's no longer a part of them, but an enemy to be overcome. And others who challenge their beliefs can be seen as agents of Lucifer. And on top of all that, we have a prophecy of a second coming, meaning eventually someone has to be Jesus, so why not yourself? There's one more thing here that I want to mention because I have to talk about it all the time to everyone I meet, despite how uncomfortable it makes the baristas at Sweetwater's. Denial of death. I've explained this before in my Cairn video, but in brief, Ernest Becker posits that most of the things we do are in an effort to mentally escape the inevitability of death. This usually comes in the form of symbolic immortality, which is often religious in nature. Examples include Mormons with their planets, Jehovah's Witnesses with their paradise, and basically any religion that promises the eternal reward of a heaven-like afterlife. It's a way to force our brains into not having to think about non-existence. A vessel of immortality. But you know who's super immortal? That's right. Some types of jellyfish. Oh, and I guess Jesus is too. But I think there's a reason for the choice of Jesus above jellyfish. Jesus was specifically designed to be supremely relatable. If he wasn't, maybe we wouldn't have so many goddamn Christians running around. Most people can, in some way, see themselves in Jesus. I see myself in Jesus as a fellow communist Jew. Others relate to the oppression he faced or the love he gave. Jesus is just so easily marketable.
But what happens when we don't see ourselves in Jesus enough? Well, simple. We change Jesus. Subscribe or check back in a while to see just how much Jesus has changed since his death. And feel free to leave a comment with your thoughts on the three Christs and the prevalence of religious paranoia.